Michael Krasny and Isabel Allende.
I thought maybe you could tell that story about when the immigration officer asked you if you were, what race you were, right?
Yeah, and I didn't know. It was the first time I was coming to the United States, and I said white. And he said, "You're not white." I said, he was African American, by the way. And I said, "What do you mean I'm not white?" And he said, "No, you're not white." So I opened my blouse and I said, "What color is this?"
You're seeing the great comedic side of Isabel Allende this evening as well. But I was just saying that the Bancroft Library recently honored Isabel and honored her with the Mark Twain Award, and those of you who've read Daughter to Fortune know that we're taken into the world that really we associate with some of Twain's work, with Bret Harte, a world of early California, of gold fever and of staking claims and mining and all of that. And I thought maybe we could begin by talking about the fact that night you said, "I came to California because of lust." I don't want this necessarily to be a motif here, but you kind of fell in love also with California. The Infinite Plan was the first book about California, about your husband Willie's life, and then it led to Daughter of Fortune, which led to Portrait in Sepia. Talk about your relationship with California. I mean, what it means to you and what it's meant to you.
Well, I came to the United States on a book tour. I had never heard of the American dream, so I wasn't planning to move here at all. I was passing by, and I met Willie, and I fell in lust with the man, and very soon in love with the land, because the place was just wonderful. And Willie showed me around San Francisco and other areas, and he started telling me about the story of the city. And I realized that San Francisco, this sophisticated and elegant and wonderful city, was only 150 years old. That before it was a little village called Yerba Buena, 300 Mormons, and the rest were all Mexicans and Native Americans who don't count most of the time. And so what really created San Francisco was this group of greedy people who came for the gold rush. Bandits, prostitutes, preachers, adventurers, that kind of people. And I thought this is a splendid time to write about, because it's a time of extremes when everything is there, you know, the best and the worst, the utopia and the greediness and the violence and racism and everything. And I started researching with the idea of writing a book about it. And it took me a long time to research, because things happened that stopped me from writing the book. First, my commitment was to write Willie's story. And so I wrote a book called The Infinite Plan. And when he read the book, he said, "Oh, I hope that when they make the movie," who was the actor that you wanted? Paul Newman. So he said, "Oh, I hope that Paul Newman," well, but he's actually too old. And I said, "Why Paul Newman?" And he said, "Because I look like Paul Newman, haven't you noticed?" And truly I hadn't, but I'm sure that when they were both young, they were probably very similar. And so I finished that book, and then my daughter fell sick, and it was a year of mourning and a horrible year. And then I wrote a book called Paula, and then I went into a writer's block. And after that, it took me a long time to get back to writing fiction, several years. And then I could write Daughter of Fortune. By then I had researched for 7 years, and I was so lucky that when I wrote the book, it was the same year that it was the 150th anniversary of the gold rush. So there were documentaries, exhibits in museums. Everybody was talking about it. So the research became so lively. It was like being there. Actually, in Oakland, there was an exhibit in which you could go into a cabin, even work with the tools that they were using for digging the gold. So it was just great.
You wanted to know about a lot of the everyday lives of people, so you really immersed yourself in the letters for this book, didn't you?
You know, first of all, the history books are written by white males. The people of color do not appear in the history books. The daily life, the lives of women, the lives of families, they are never in the history books. Mm-hmm. So if you want to create historical fiction and you want to portray daily life, you have to go to other sources. And the best sources in that case were letters, because the miners wrote many letters. And it's fascinating, the letter thing, because the ships would bring the mail to San Francisco. And they would put up the flags of all the countries where the letter and the places where the letters came from, and people would stand in a line all day while they were sorting the mail, and nobody complained because it was just the anxiety of receiving the mail. Those were the ones that lived in San Francisco, but then the rest of the mail had to be delivered. They would go on muleback, and the person who delivered the mail, a very famous person, was called Charles. And this little man, always wearing gloves, that had this train of mules and would go up to the Sierras to distribute the mail. To send a letter, you would have to pay 1 ounce of gold. But to receive it, you would have to pay 3 ounces of gold. And that was because they were so desperate to receive news from home. Now, this little man, Charles, when he died and they were dressing the body for the funeral, they found out that he was a woman. And she always wore gloves because she had the hands of a woman.
Was that an inspiration to do all the cross-dressing that
Yes.
you did? Yeah.
Yes. It's very Shakespearean, you know. But the cross-dressing is interesting because the first, I would say, year and a half until the 49ers came, it was the gold rush was an all-male event. Young men that came from all over the world. There were practically no women. The women that came were prostitutes, Chilean, Peruvian, Mexican, and a few Americans that came through Panama. And in this very male world, they would have to. They were fascinated by the idea of anything feminine. They would travel miles to see a teacher, for example, because it was a unique thing for them, something that would move them to tears sometimes, or to see a child. I lost my train of thought. What are we talking about?
We're talking about cross-dressing.
Cross-dressing, So when I was thinking of telling the story I wanted to tell it from the perspective of a woman, a person of color, and a Chilean woman, because it was easier for me and because many Chileans came. But I didn't want it to be a prostitute because it's such a sad life. There's like no redeeming quality in that. So I thought, what could she do to blend in this masculine world? And then when I started doing the research, I found Charles, and I found several other women that dressed like men. In some cases, everybody knew that they were women, but they were treated like men. They were cowboys. They did the same work that men did. In other cases, like Charles, they didn't know that it was a woman.
It's in some ways, I don't want to talk about Daughter of Fortune because that's what a lot of the focus is on this evening, but in some ways it's certainly easy to characterize it as a feminist novel, and you've said, remember you telling me that feminism saved your life, that feminism really provided an outlet for anger, as did journalism earlier on before you became a novelist. And in a sense, you're talking about a kind of feminism that was able to, or independence of spirit, able to bloom at that time when it was so difficult for women to find autonomy and to find independence. But nevertheless, the consciousness and the possibility of consciousness, apparently, from your research, proved to be there.
You know, there have always been strong, independent women who have had to live in the patriarchy. And for centuries, we have had these women in history. But I was lucky enough to be in my early 20s when there was a large movement of women, the women's lib, something that was a real revolution that had not happened before. And I was living in Chile, in the end of the world, in the most Catholic and conservative society in the world. I mean, if you think that Ireland is Catholic, wait until you go to Chile. Chile is more Catholic than the Vatican. And I come from a very conservative background. And so there was no outlet for all the anger I felt, and I couldn't articulate it. And then in my 20s, I started reading all those books written by...
Did you read like de Beauvoir and
Yes, I started reading Simone de Beauvoir and all the American feminists and European English also. And then I realized that there were all these women out there feeling the same thing I was feeling, but they could say it nicely. They could say it intelligently. I could only be angry. And so then I started working as a journalist, and I could channel all that somehow.
There were some that were angry too. Kate Millett comes to mind, for example, and Betty Friedan had her anger too. But you talk about channeling. Eliza Summers, you felt may have been you in another life?
Well, let's not get so esoteric, Michael. No, this is how Eliza Summers was created. I needed a woman, young, who could dress like a man and pass for a man. Therefore, she couldn't have big boobs and big hips, none of that. She had to be slim and boyish looking. She had to speak English because she had to come to the gold rush and be able to fend for herself. So I decided that she would be someone from the British colony in Chile. There was a large British colony in Valparaiso because the British controlled all the trade in the Pacific. And their base was in Valparaiso, in the port of Valparaiso. That's why we in Chile have such a large British influence. We think of ourselves as the British of Latin America. And we think that the British are the Chileans of Europe.
Now, you make it sound as if you pretty much invented the character and had the character in mind in a certain way. The same with the Chinese character in the novel?
No, the Chinese character Tao Chien is just one of those things that happen. I had this girl. Why would a girl that is raised in a Victorian household in 1848 travel to the gold rush, to the most dangerous place in the world? Why would she do that? Or by herself? She wouldn't come for the gold. She wouldn't come for fame. Women only do that for love. And so she would have to come after a lover. Now, it was a very risky thing to do. Why wouldn't she wait for the lover over there to come back with the gold? Well, she's pregnant. But I can't have a woman pregnant in the gold rush. Could I? How can I dress her like a man if she has a belly? I can't. So I needed her to have a miscarriage. This is the good thing about being an author, you know. You can do all these things. And so she needed a miscarriage. But now, if she has a miscarriage as a stowaway in the bowels of a ship, she'll die. So I needed a doctor. But it couldn't be a Western doctor because he wouldn't be in the ship. He wouldn't be helping a stowaway in the ship. So I thought, well, a Chinese doctor could help. Why would be a Chinese doctor there? Because they Shanghaied people. They would kidnap people and force them into the ships. The way they would get the sailors then is that they would come to San Francisco or Shanghai or wherever, and they would get them drunk in a bar, and then when they were unconscious, completely drunk, get them in the ship, force them to sign a document that was practically slavery for 2 years, and by the time they wake up, they're already at sea, so they can't escape. And there was a verb for that, to Shanghai somebody. So I thought, okay, this Chinese doctor was drunk, he was Shanghaied, and he's in the ship. He's the cook in the ship. So I needed him for 15 pages to save the girl. But he stayed. And he got off the ship with her in San Francisco. And I couldn't get rid of him in San Francisco either. He followed her to Sacramento. And so I couldn't get rid of him in Sacramento. It was just the kind of character that stays, and then he came back in Portrait in Sepia.
Characters do things against your will sometimes, don't they?
All the time.
Yeah.
They surprise me with...
Did the I don't want to spoil the ending, obviously, but the ending had to do with a dream.
What dream?
Did you have a dream? Well, first of all, you left the ending kind of ambiguous intentionally, didn't you?
Yeah. because she comes to the gold rush to look for her lover. And then there's all this adventure in which she risks her life many times. And at the end, she doesn't find love. She finds something more precious than love. She finds freedom. And once she has that, then nothing else matters much. When she says there's a moment in the book when she surprised me. When she finds herself in front of a jar where there's a human head, the head of Joaquin Murrieta, she looks at the jar because she's looking for the man that she's
whose name is also Joaquin.
Yeah, who's also Joaquin. She's looking for her man, and she suspects that the head in the jar might be her lover. So she looks at the jar, and then she says, I am free now. What else can you add to that? Does it matter if it was Joaquin Murrieta or not? Does it matter if it's the lover or not? Who cares? She's free.
Was this something that you wanted? I mean, you had a great story to tell, an adventure story, an odyssey, really, but you also wanted to impress upon the reader that freedom should be perhaps even more valuable and more to be cherished than love. It was a didactic purpose, a teaching purpose behind it?
No, there's never a teaching purpose. The minute you start teaching, Michael, I'm telling you this because you're a new author. The minute you start teaching, preaching, you're screwed. Forget that.
Show, don't tell.
Yeah.
Yeah. But is there a sense sometimes in your writing where, I mean, for example, you're talking about your concern about people of color and immigrants, and all of that comes through in when you speak, and all the compassion you have comes through in your novels too. It's transmuted in a sense through the plot and the story. You're always telling the story, but your attitudes are there, aren't they?
Well, whoever you are will come through the lines.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're a bitch, no matter how much you preach, you're still a bitch. And it will be there in between the lines. So be careful.
I'm not writing fiction, so I'm going to be clear.
You can't write about something that you don't believe, something that is alien to you, that you're not familiar with, that is not your experience. Even if it's historical fiction, why do you choose to write about that character and no other character? Because you're exploring something in yourself.
Let's explore something. I mean, here we are in a Dominican university, and you once said to me that many years ago, one of our first interviews, you said, I always know if I need to get a taxi cab, I'll say a Hail Mary and I'll get a cab. And sorry, I have one of those kind of memories. And you also have a kind of strong identification, at least through literary criticism and those who opine on these things, with magical realism, which has a kind of spiritual undercutting to it. So, and spirituality is very important to you. I mean, not necessarily Catholicism, but spirituality. Is there a distinction that we should make?
I'm very fortunate that I was raised Catholic. It's a great religion to have belonged to. Because it has, all the color, the rituals, the imagery. I'm sorry, I'm in the Dominican university. I shouldn't be talking like this. And I think that the Pope is really picturesque. So it's wonderful to have been a Catholic. I'm sorry, you're a priest there, yeah. And so all that color comes in the books. Now, what is magic realism? It's hard to define, because magic realism, I think, is accepting that the world is a very mysterious place where things happen all the time. And let me give just one example, because Lindsay is here. Lindsay is Willie's oldest son. Lindsay was born the same day and the same year at the same time of the day that my daughter Paula was born. So Willie's son was being born. Willie was receiving his first son in the same moment that I was giving birth to my first daughter. So that kind of coincidence is mysterious. That's magic realism to me. It means that there are connections somewhere that we can't explain. My daughter Paula was born the same day as Julia, who is also here in the room. I don't know where she is, the 22nd of October, who she was born the same day than my daughter Paula, and she's the second wife of Ernesto, Paula's husband, widower. So all those things, the fact that these three people were born the same day is very strange. That's magic realism. Things that you can see, that you can perceive, that you can prove that they have happened, and yet they have no explanation. The difference between magic realism and fantasy is that fantasy has no grounding on reality. For example, the invisibility cloak of Harry Potter is fantasy. Invisible Indians in the Amazon that paint their bodies in such a way that they blend in nature, that's magic realism. So there is an explanation, and you can see them.
Dates are very important to you. You always start books on the same date. You have commented, as many have, on the fact that 9/11 was also the same day that the...
It was a Tuesday.
Yes.
It was a Tuesday, September 11th, 1973, the military coup in Chile.
Yeah.
And it was almost at the same time of the day that the terrorist attack here.
Was it difficult, though? I mean, you were influenced by writers who have this identity as magic realists, Gabriel Garcia Marquez particularly, and Pablo Neruda, more a poet, but still who sees things in the way you've described. To establish yourself as a woman apart from those kinds of writers, to establish yourself apart from even a writer like Vargas Llosa or Fuentes. I mean, you have done it brilliantly, if I may say so. But there was always that kind of patriarchal model for you to follow, so you had to find your own voice, as so many women writers say they have to?
Well, when I was young, I loved stories and storytelling and reading, but I never thought I could be a writer because there were no role models, really. The writers were all male. They all had mustache. I knew, of course, that there had been some women writers, most of them British spinsters. They were dead. They had committed suicide. They were not really great role models. So I came to writing very late, and when I started writing, the boom of Latin American literature was all over the world. I mean, there were 25 or 30 great writers from Latin America, all men. It was an all-male club.
All mustaches. Yeah.
Most of them with mustaches. That they had taken by assault the literary world. There were no women in that group. So then The House of the Spirits was published, and it was successful. And then people said that I did not belong to the boom. I came after the boom, so I'm post-boom. Being post anything is like post-menopause. It's just, you don't want to be post anything, but that's what I am.
House of the Spirits was a letter to your grandfather, wasn't it?
It started as a letter for my grandfather, but I think that I knew very soon that it didn't look like a letter.
Mm. And did Marquez tell you that you should be a novelist?
No.
Who told you?
Pablo Neruda.
Oh, it was Neruda, yeah.
When I was a young journalist in Chile, I wrote some humorous columns in a magazine. By the way, I'm very funny in Spanish. So I had this thing in this magazine, which Pablo Neruda apparently liked. And then one day he invited me. This was a few weeks before the military coup. This was in August, beginning of August of 1973. And Pablo Neruda had received the Nobel Prize in 1972. He was sick, and he was living in Isla Negra, in the beach, in this house that is now a museum. And he invited me to his house. So I thought, oh, the greatest poet wants me to interview him. I am the greatest journalist in this country. So I bought a new tape recorder, I brushed my car, and I drove all the way in winters, very windy and rainy, all the way to the beach, 2 hours at the time. Now it's a shorter road. And we had a wonderful conversation. He showed me his beautiful collections of junk, bottles, junk. Today, this is collections. Then it was just trash. And then we had a wonderful Chilean sea bass with a bottle of wine, and then I noticed that he was getting tired. And I said, well, I'm ready for the interview, Don Paulo. And he said, which interview? And I said, well, I've come to interview you. And he said, I would never allow you to interview me. You are the worst journalist in this country. You lie all the time. You put yourself in the middle of everything. And I'm sure that if you don't have a story, you make it up. Why don't you switch to literature, where all these defects are virtues? You know, I could have worked for Fox News.
You do know your crowd.
If I say this in Texas, I get booed.
There's the old metaphor about, probably overused, about novelists who have written many novels as you have. Each of the novels is a child almost, and you've written children's books too. Where does Daughter of Fortune fit in terms of your own, that fancy word, oeuvre? That is, I mean, in terms of all of your children, if all of your novels are children.
I have written several historical novels, and I think that that's where this one would fit. Portrait in Sepia, The House of the Spirits, Daughter of Fortune, Sorrow. They are all placed in a time and in a country or in a place that is very particular and determines the story. So that's where I would place it. I wrote it 10 years ago, and I've been writing for 25 years, so it's in the middle. My middle child.
You know, it was no less than Dr. Johnson who said we're all children of fortune, really, and our children are children of fortune. In a sense, one sees that with Eliza, doesn't one? That circumstances and just fate and determinism and all the sense of what we hope is free will can take us in all these different directions that we can't predict. Yeah?
How could I have ever predicted that my life would turn out the way it did? I was brought up to be somebody's wife, to have children. I didn't have any education. I never went to college. I was not supposed to do anything different from what I was raised to do. I remember when I started to write as a journalist, and I started writing feminist articles, my grandfather was appalled that I was, first of all, doing gossiping. I mean, the press was gossiping. And it was this thing, I'm exposing myself out there. This was ridiculous. And he felt personally offended. The family was offended. So who would expect me to write a book, or that the book would be successful, or that I would keep writing, that I would come to the United States and meet Willie? Why? I mean, all those things happened by chance. Willie says that when we met, we had met before in other lives. We had a spiritual connection. I didn't feel like that at all.
Willie had been living too long in Marin, I think.
Yeah. I had a free night. I had been living in chastity for a very long time. 2 or 3 weeks, as I recall. So that's what it was, nothing else. And then how did it turn out to be a marriage of 20 years? I have no idea. I think that maybe it's because we have not had any other opportunities. No choices.
Just thinking of that old button that used to say "Chase makes waste" for some reason. But I was also thinking about there were buttons that were popular in the '60s, like Marcel Proust was a yenta was one, and Proust said all literature is gossip. I was struck by your talking about gossip.
Somebody asked me today. I don't know if the person is here, but you did. She asked me, "What do you think of gossip?" And I said, "It's fine. I mean, gossip is everything. Gossip is what we talk, what we think, what we read, what we hear in the radio, the news. Everything is gossip." My grandfather would say that everything is gossip, and he would have forbidden everything. I grew up in a household where the radio was forbidden because my grandfather said that was vulgar gossip. So you couldn't listen to the radio.
Talk a bit about your relationship with your mother, because it's so unusual and so moving and extraordinary in many ways. I mean, you've kept this, through all the distance to Chile, you've kept this close, intimate relationship with your mother. It's almost like an umbilical cord.
It is.
It is, yeah.
My mother is the longest and most solid love affair in my life. It started before I was born, and it still goes on. And I write to my mother every day, and she does too. My mother is 86, and she writes me every day by email now. Before it used to be the mailman, but now it's email. And we keep the letters. We print them, and I put them in a basket. By the end of the year, I wrap them and put them in a closet. She does the same in Chile, and she gives me back my letters because she says, at my age, I don't want to die and somebody else read the letters. And what do we write every day? Gossip. Just gossip. We exchange recipes, dreams, stories, and we keep this umbilical cord alive. When I think that my mother will die probably before I do, it breaks my heart. Breaks my heart, because it's wow, to be an orphan, how awful.
Well, on a somber note, before when Paula died, before Paula died, I know you've said that you didn't really think that you could go on, and yet, again, the unpredictable perhaps. Here you are, not only here you are, but after the terrible loss and tragedy that you endured, and the suffering that you endured, unspeakable suffering, I'm sure, you were able to write that book, and you were able to write the book that brought you kind of out of your grief, the book of recipes and the book of aphrodisiacs and love, really. I
think that if you ask any person what's the worst thing that could happen to you, is the death of a child. We just can't conceive that. And within a matter of a year, I lost my daughter and Willie lost his daughter. So we both went through a very, very dark time. And it didn't bring us closer. During that time of grief, I think that we separated, and each one was like isolated and closed, completely closed. And we were fighting like crazy. And I remember that I started talking about divorce. Willie had gone through 2 divorces, and he said, no, we're going to therapy. Being Chilean, I don't believe in therapy. So, but he forced me to therapy. So we went, finally. And we went to this therapist. I had never been in therapy before. And I was calculating how much this was costing per minute. And this guy wasn't saying anything. And so are we paying this guy just to listen? So we started talking, and more we were saying what had happened in our lives about Jennifer and about Paula and about everything else. And he was like a monk, shaved head, green tea, closed eyes, a mandala on the wall, very Marin County. And then when we finished talking, our time was limited, he opened his eyes and he said, there is so much sadness in your lives, so much sadness. And we just broke down and started crying. We had never admitted to ourselves that we had a broken heart, and that it was not about divorce, it was about grief and about death and about losses. And I really thought that first of all, our marriage was not going to survive, and that I could not live with the grief that I was carrying. And then I wrote that book, and the book carried me through the first year, which was the worst. Every day getting up in the morning and going to write, and with Paula's picture there, and some days it was just crying. And other days the book just flowed as if dictated by Paula from the beyond. And then at the end of the year, I had gone through a tunnel and I could see the light, but more important, I had been able to to name things. I work with language, with words. And when you name things, you set limits to reality. When you say woman, you imagine something. There's an image that accompanies the word. When you say death, my daughter has died, then it has limits. It's just that your daughter died, but your grandchildren are alive. The world is still there. It's sunny today. Your husband is waiting for you. So the limit of the grief becomes named, and language, in a way, gives shape to reality.
Form and helps to heal.
Yeah. And so when the book was published and I got the response from the readership, thousands of letters, I realized that I was not alone, that my grief was shared by millions of people who had gone through the same thing, that it was the oldest sorrow in the world to lose your children. It has always happened, and it will always happen. So it was nothing new. I was not special in any way. And it was a very healing thing for me. But then, after I wrote the book, I went into a writer's block that lasted 3 years. I couldn't write at all. And I remember I was at Book Passage, my favorite bookstore where I go all the time, and I was there having a cup of tea, and Annie Lamott showed up. And she said, "How are you?" And I said, "Like shit. I can't write a word." And she said, "Why?" I said, "I'm in a writer's block." She said, "There's no such a thing as a writer's block. Your reservoirs are empty. Fill them up." And I said, "Wow." It opened a door, The reservoirs are empty. So I thought, I'm a journalist by training. I can write about almost anything if I'm giving a subject and enough time to research. Well, not sports, but almost anything else. And so I gave myself a subject that would be as removed from grief and death and loss as possible. And I decided to write about lust and gluttony, the only deadly sins that are worth the trouble. And so I started researching for lust and gluttony and the bridge between them, which
is there a dream about Antonio Banderas?
Yes, that saved me. I had a dream that I placed a naked Antonio Banderas on a Mexican tortilla. I slathered him with guacamole and salsa, and then I rolled him up and ate him. I woke up Willie, of course, immediately. And then the next day, I had a dream that I was swimming in a swimming pool full of rice pudding with a naked Antonio Banderas. So I woke up Willie again. And the third night, he suggested therapy. Again.
We're going to take questions from you and pose them to Isabel. But first, I had to ask you. You're talking about Willie in The Infinite Plan. Paul Newman playing Willie. I see more Brad Pitt, but that's. And now we mentioned Antonio Banderas. Who would you like? I mean, there's a talk about making Daughter of Fortune into a movie. Who would you like to cast in Daughter of Fortune?
I don't know, because she's 16 in the book. She's very, very young, and I don't see any actress so young that could play the role. I don't know. I don't care. I really don't. But I want Penelope Cruz to play me.
Where is our friend Elaine Petruccelli?
There.
Oh, right behind us. Elaine, you have some questions, from the audience.
We have so many good questions. I know we don't have time to answer them all. But one person who has loved both Daughter of Fortune and Portrait of Sepia wants to know if you'll do a sequel to Portrait in Sepia. Is there any chance of that?
Well, the sequel to Portrait in Sepia is The House of the Spirits, which I wrote first. But Portrait in Sepia is like the bridge between Daughter of Fortune and The House of the Spirits. Some of the characters go to the house. But that's a problem there, because when I wrote Portrait in Sepia, I have a character, Severo del Valle, who later becomes the father of Clara in the House of the Spirits. And in Portrait in Sepia, he loses a leg in the war. And I forgot about that, and in the House of the Spirits, he has 2 legs. So I have a missing limb that is floating somewhere in space.
And another person who did understand that House of the Spirits was the sequel wants to know about the green hair, the characters with the green hair.
Well, the green hair has 2 explanations. You can choose. The first one is that I had green hair, not by choice, but by a mistake. I bought the wrong product, and I ended up with hair like parsley, and it took some time to get rid of it. But also, there was the character of Rose, who has green hair in the House of the Spirits. She really existed. She was Rosa Barros, the first fiancée of my grandfather. And this girl died at 19 in very mysterious circumstances. Apparently she was poisoned, but it was never found out exactly what happened. 8 years later, my grandfather married her youngest sister, my grandmother. And the portrait of Rosa was always on the piano in our house. And it was a sepia portrait, an old photograph, a small old photograph. And my grandfather used to say that Rosa was beautiful like a mermaid. And I had a fairy tale book in which the mermaid had green hair. So I always imagined as a child that Rosa had green hair, and I thought it was poetic to leave the image in the book.
And since we're talking about images, someone has asked if you would tell the story about how you came to the portrait on the cover of Daughter of Fortune.
The portrait in the cover of Daughter of Fortune is a woman called Petrina. She used to work in a coffee shop in San Rafael in 4th Street. Aroma was the name? Yeah, Aroma. Beautiful, beautiful young woman. And when I saw her, I told Willie, this is how Elisa should look. And he said, let's take a picture. And so I asked her, and instead of taking a snapshot, we decided to take a real portrait in a studio with the technique of the daguerreotype and have her use a museum dress of the time. Do you have it? Yeah, so that's Petrina. I could never find Petrina to give her the book. So I don't know if she has ever read it. By the way, she doesn't speak a word of Spanish. Her father is Polish, her mother Japanese, I think.
On a serious note, a teacher in the audience teaches literature, history, and culture. And she teaches her high school students about the coup in Chile and subsequent literature. And she'd like to know how this terrible event influenced your writing. And also another question that you might put with it is, have you been able to live with the anger of what happened there?
I would not be a writer today, maybe. I would not be a writer today if I had stayed in Chile. I would probably be still a lousy journalist. And a happy one, probably. But the military coup changed the lives of millions of people. And, of course, my family, too. My uncle, Salvador Allende, died the day of the coup. Most of the Allende family immediately left the next day in a plane that the Mexican embassy the Mexican government sent a plane to rescue all these people, and they brought them to Mexico. But I stayed in Chile with my husband and my 2 kids, and I stayed for a year and a half until I couldn't take it any longer, and I left also. We almost escaped. And we lived for 13 years as political refugees in Venezuela. I felt that my life was so miserable. I was so frustrated my life was going nowhere. I had what I thought was a career, a life, a plan. I was going somewhere, you know. And then the military coup happened and it cut my life in half. And it cut my life in half. And so when, in my 30s, in my early 30s, I think I became a writer because I could not be a journalist in Venezuela. And I had all these stories to tell and all this anger and this frustration that gave birth to the House of the Spirits. I'm not an angry person, and I am very sorry that the military coup happened in Chile for innumerable reasons. And I lost my innocence with that event, in the sense that before I thought that the world was a nice place, a place where people were basically good. Now I think that there is a dimension of evil and violence in every human being and in every society. And we make rules, and we make rules to control that. But given the wrong circumstances, that emerges, that violence and that capacity for evil. And so now I'm less naive about the world.
Did you feel encouraged by meeting the new Chilean president? You met her recently, didn't you?
Yeah. I have known her from before. Michelle Bachelet, the new president of Chile, is an extraordinary woman. Her life story is very interesting. Her father was a general who did not comply with the coup, and he was arrested by his peers, and he died in torture. His wife and his daughter, Michelle Bachelet, were arrested also, and they were also tortured. And Michelle, eventually they were able to leave the country. She became a doctor, returned to Chile. She was first Minister of Health, and then she became the first woman Minister of Defense. So she had to deal with the military, with the same people who had killed her father and who had tortured her and her mother. And her job was to give them back the dignity that they had lost in 17 years of violence and corruption. And she did it. And then she was elected candidate almost by acclaim, and she won the election. And when she became president, she appointed half women and half men in every level of government. So for the first time, we have feminine energy in the management of a country. We'll see what they do with it. I hope they don't fuck up.
We have time for maybe one or two more questions. Speaking of women, this person loves your latest book, Inez of My Soul, and particularly the adventure and all of the husbands or men. And she wants to know how much of this was history and how much did you just make up?
In the case of Inez of My Soul, it's history. It seems like it isn't because it's so magical in some moments. Everything is historical. For example, the fact that Inez found water in the desert and saved the troops in every instance across the desert, that's historical. It's recorded by the historians of the time. And many other moments in the book that seem too weird to be true. Inez Suarez was the only Spanish woman that accompanied 110 conquistadors that went to Chile in 1540. She went, again, not for gold or fame, she went for love. She was the mistress of Pedro de Valdivia. And everything that I tell in the book is true. What I had to create was her voice, because, as I said before, history is written by men. The voices of women are never there. And so she did the same things that the conquistadors did, and she lived much longer than any of them, and she became the second richest person in the country. She was also a very good businesswoman. The first richest person was, of course, the bishop, the Catholic bishop. And So everything that I had, the only thing that I had to do was just recreate her voice. It was easy. It was easy to imagine that she was an attractive woman because 2 men lost their lives for her. It was easy to imagine that she was very healthy because she lived so long, and she did all the things she did. She was very brave because she had an armor and a sword and was fighting against the bravest warriors in Latin America, the Mapuche. So all these things are sort of logic, you know. I didn't have to invent much.
A young person who loved The City of Beasts and all of the books that followed has asked, how did you happen to do those books, and will there be more books for children?
No, there will be no more books for kids. I don't like kids. The only reason I wrote them was because I have 3 grandchildren. I had promised them a book for each one of them, and there's the trilogy, goodbye. I don't like kids.
Sometimes Neruda is right. Sometimes she does lie. Isabel, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for this magical evening.
Thank you very much.